Any product reflects the society which manufactured it, and more specifically the creators of that product. So we need to strive to ensure that our products cause as little harm as possible to individuals, to society, and to the environment. I'm Adam Porter, I'm a board game inventor from Cardiff in Wales, and this series of videos has explored many aspects of product design, mostly related to generating a financially viable product. But like most reasonable adults, I'm not comfortable with a ruthless, profit above all attitude to product creation. I'd like to see things done right. This is a particularly difficult video to make because I know that I'm not an expert. I know that I have loads to learn, and I know that I've made errors and will continue to do so in the future. I'm a white cis man in an industry full of white cis men, and as such I can only try to put myself in the shoes of people less privileged and listen to them when they say that certain things in the industry need to change. There are really two groups of designers that I'm addressing here. In the era of crowdfunding, many designers publish their own games. They have total control over the presentation of their product. The issues we're discussing here really ought to be at the forefront of their minds. As most of my viewers will know, I license my games to publishers, and this means I have limited control over the presentation of the final product. Does that mean I can absolve myself of responsibility for the social and environmental impact of my game? No, I don't think so, or at least not entirely. I've certainly learned lessons throughout my game design career, and I approach things slightly differently nowadays than I did at the beginning. So what are we talking about here? Well, we're talking about accessibility, respect, inclusion, and sustainability. Accessibility in the sense of making your games playable by the widest possible audience, regardless of physical, mental, social, or sensory differences. Respect in the sense of taking great care in your depiction of individuals, groups, cultures, and traditions. Inclusion in terms of making your game relatable to all so that everyone feels welcome at the table. And sustainability in terms of a game's impact on the environment. I remember sitting at a playtest table with Bez, and she showed off her prototype game In a Bind, which went on to become the very successful party game Yogi. Bez explained that this game was a bit like Twister, but it was far more accessible because it all happens above the table. You don't have to leave your seat, you don't have to crawl around and contort your spine into all sorts of uncomfortable positions. And at the grand old age of 43, with a persistently aching back, I already appreciate this approach. The thought of playing Twister doesn't fill me with glee, but playing Yogi does. Of course, even Yogi has substantial limitations though. You need significant mobility in order to twist your upper body into the necessary positions, and considerable stamina to hold those poses. But nonetheless, it has opened up the fun of Twister to a much wider audience than it had before. A priority that I identified in my earliest designs was that I wanted to avoid text in my games wherever possible. This was partially a commercial decision. It meant that my games could be sold worldwide without the need for multiple editions, but also a sense that a wide audience could play, whatever their reading ability or nationality. It was a big part of the inspiration for my games Big Bazaar and Zooligans, both of which resemble other text-heavy games, but replace the text with tons of great pictures. My game Pikoko isn't colourblind friendly, and that's a regret. I recently played the Peacock card game Enchanted Plumes, and I love the variety of styles in the different feather cards. Each colour of feather is a slightly different shape, and the final look is gorgeous, but more importantly, the game can now be played even by people who can't distinguish one colour from another. My initial prototype of Pikoko wasn't colourblind friendly, and I always had it in mind that a publisher might fix that, most likely by working with an in-house graphic designer. I know that that caused a headache for Brain Games. These guys do care about their players, and it was a problem that they wanted to address. The issue was that some of the cards are multi-suited. They have 3 different colours on a single card at the same time. Including symbols to represent those colours made the game look messy, and this was a game that was always going to be sold on its table presence. I learnt from this experience, and colourblind accessibility was at the forefront of our minds as Rob Fisher and I designed the game Quazzle. The game is all about laying out patterns of colours to match those on the cards. And from the earliest stages, we incorporated icons onto the cubes, each corresponding to a specific colour. It made the game look really striking, and it made Quazzle playable for most people. In an upcoming game, Rob Fisher and I ran colours through colourblind filters online to ensure that the prototype was accessible, and the publisher was encouraged to do the same for the final production. Board games are complex and tactile and often visually busy items. They frequently require complex reasoning, social interaction, numeracy, and memory. The attempt to make all games playable by all people is a lofty ideal, and one which is always going to be frustratingly out of grasp. but that doesn't mean it's not something which we should be conscious of. As an industry, collectively reaching for something which is unattainable is going to at least result in movement in the right direction. A few years ago, I was co-designing a card game. The game had players positioning cards in columns with values increasing further up the column. And as with most simple card games, it was an abstract exercise. But during early playtests, we lazily pasted totem pole artwork onto the cards. It just seemed a logical setting for the game. My co-designer and I are thoughtful enough individuals that we did at least consider that we ought to do some research before settling on the theme. And I set about reading about totem poles. Up to that point, the extent of my knowledge was based on childhood cartoons from the 1980s and Lucky Luke picture books. I enjoyed researching totem poles. They're really beautiful and they're fascinating. And they're really, really important to certain indigenous American groups. They're not exotic toys to brighten up a drab-looking British card game. In those early prototypes, my colleague and I were certainly not mocking totem poles, but we were exploiting a subject which we didn't truly understand. So we dropped that theme. Does this mean that nobody who is not an indigenous American can make a game about totem poles? Well, I have no idea. That's not for me to dictate. I think the designers need to ask themselves, does this game run the risk of causing hurt to any individual or group? And then make a judgment about how to proceed. Now, I've stopped short of saying that the risk of causing offence should prevent a designer moving forward. Some really worthwhile pursuits are challenging to establish norms, and positive progress will always be offensive to some sections of society. But if that's not your intent with your game, then you're probably better rethinking your theming to avoid unnecessary upset or perpetuating negative or harmful stereotypes. I have a room full of board games, and very few of them are high fantasy. Not that many games on my shelf feature overtly sexualised or objectified representations of women. But I'm quite sure that that's an unintentional consequence of my preference for medium-weight Euros, family games, abstracts and card games. I've seen enough images online to know that this stuff is rife in the board game industry. When I rediscovered hobby gaming a decade ago, I picked up a copy of Super Dungeon Explore. I loved the cute, chibi aesthetic. I played it with several groups and I had a great time with it. Then I played it with one particular friend who couldn't get past the weird sexualised chibis. He was right. It is odd and it's off-putting, and I never really managed to enjoy the game again. And I'm not pretending that that sort of creepy stuff isn't lurking somewhere in the shadows among these very wholesome-looking games on my shelves. Take a look at this card from one of the Agricola expansion decks. In Potato Man, they managed to sexualise a potato. A potato. It was a really positive step when Pandemic revitalised its cover art a few years ago. No longer were women pushed to the sidelines, but the new cover featured a strong, realistic image of a female scientist intent on saving the world, and she was up front and centre. Of course, the issues with inclusion don't stop at objectivisation, it's the language we use. Take a look at this box for Dice Run. Gentlemen, start your dice. I've never once played this game with a mixed gender group and not had it remarked upon. In fact, it's frequently resulted in a really sour feeling before the game even begins. But let's give Dice Run the benefit of the doubt. Gentlemen, start your engines is a recognisable, if outdated phrase. It's a cultural reference. Nobody gets upset about the title of the game Men at Work, which was notably designed by a woman. Surely it's a fuss over nothing, isn't it? Yet, of course, the rulebook for Dice Run persistently refers to players as male. During his turn, a player must play one card from his hand, etc, etc. And I know that this is a slightly obscure title from a smaller publisher, so here's San Juan from Ravensburger. Now my copy is full of male pronouns, and maybe I should be upgrading to the much improved second edition, which seems to have resolved some of these issues. I'd like to think that this was a problem which is becoming less and less frequent over time. I think when it happens, often it's a translation issue, and indeed, I can't find an example from a recent game to show you, so that's progress. But it is something for designers to be aware of. You will generally be sent a copy of the rules from the publisher before your game goes to print. Proofread them carefully. You'd be surprised how often this stuff creeps in there, and it will alienate a significant portion of your audience. If writing in English, address players directly by saying, on your turn, you do this. Or if you must use third person, use the singular they, which excludes no one. At this point, I would say that this is industry standard. You don't want to get left behind. My dice game, Throne, is full of characters. In an early prototype, there were 40 of them. By the final production version, it was reduced to 20-ish. The characters in the prototype were diverse, and I'd made a real effort to subvert traditional gender norms. For many of the characters, the gender was totally ambiguous, and the more obviously female characters had prominent, active physical roles: a wizard, a warrior. It was clear from the early stages of production that the budget for the game was tight. And I had crammed 40 dice into that prototype. That was always going to eat into the budget for other components, as well as the budget for the art. When I was shown a handful of sample images, I was really happy with the quality of the artwork, and I didn't think to highlight my wish for diversity in the game. When the final images came through, the diversity had all but disappeared. As a new designer at the time, I was really conscious of the fact that I was working with a major publisher and a very small budget, and I didn't want to create any waves. So I only made fairly minor requests. A couple of characters were changed from male to female, some skin tones were adjusted, and a bit of exposed skin was covered. And the result is not a bastion of diversity, but I was grateful that my requests were taken seriously. WizKids were approachable and open, and I'm sure they would have accommodated my wishes if I'd been a little bit bolder in my requests. I reflected on this experience, and in future projects I'm going to be braver. When Compromat was signed to Helvetique, I expressed at an early stage that diversity was important to my co-designer Rob and myself. As a two-player card game with only a small number of people depicted in the game, it was impossible to represent the full diversity of the human species, but at the very least we wanted male and female representation to be equally prominent. I doubt the team at Helvetique would have had it any other way, regardless of my requests. The players represent two spies, one male, one female, both equally prominent on the cover of the game. The female bartender is as pivotal as the male informant. The female counterintelligence agents outnumber the males. Look at this design from Canadian publisher Scorpion Masqué. Zombie Team's Evolution was recently nominated for the Spiel des Jahres. It's a brilliant cooperative legacy game for families. The diversity illustrated throughout the game is admirable, but Scorpion Masqué don't make a big deal out of it. It's just there. Nothing feels out of place or forced. Roleplayer from Thunderworks features double-sided player boards on which players place their dice to score points. One side of the board features a male version of the character, the other side features a female version. Both sides function identically, so players can just choose a character which they relate to. Steampunk Rally features a wide range of playable characters, each based on an influential scientist from the past. The included characters are diverse, and each is given a short biography in the rulebook. This serves to highlight many important scientists whom history has tended to ignore. Jason Perez from YouTube channel Shelf Stories does a great job of exploring difficult subjects relating to inclusion, diversity, accessibility and respect in board games. And Wingspan designer Elizabeth Hargrave discusses the topic extensively in her many interviews and blog posts, as well as on her Twitter feed. I'll add a couple of links in the video description below so you can check them out. I would advise all designers to think really carefully about what matters to them in their designs, not just in terms of the gameplay, but also in terms of theme and aesthetics, and make that clear to the publisher of the game at a very early stage before development begins and before art is commissioned. The publisher might have a different opinion to you, and there's always room for discussion and debate, but stand up for your views. It's important that you collectively produce a product which you as designer can be proud of. Sustainability is a massive topic, and it's one that I don't have a chance of doing justice to in such a short video. It's also another area where I feel totally out of my depth. I watched a video recently by Jonah from the YouTube channel One Pip Wonder about rating games for eco-friendliness. I would strongly recommend watching. I learned a lot. Jonah reviews board games and gives them a star rating for their environmental credentials. She awards points to publishers for stating where their raw materials come from, for having stated environmental goals, for reducing plastic components, shrink wrap and box inserts, for adjusting the types of ink that they use to ensure that products can be recycled, for offsetting carbon emissions, and for making recycling information clear to consumers. She also deducts ratings for single-use products such as legacy games. So coming back to Zombie Teens, I noticed this little unassuming symbol in the back of the rulebook, which indicates that new trees are planted as more games are produced. Scorpion Masqué reports on their website that they have helped plant nearly 15,000 trees since their inception in 2010. Zombie Teens isn't perfect from an environmental standpoint. There's an unnecessary plastic insert, the game was sold in shrink wrap, and there are a small number of plastic components. But despite being a legacy game, it is totally replayable upon completion. There are cardboard standees where other games might feature plastic miniatures, and the box isn't oversized at all. I haven't paid a lot of attention to Scorpion Masque in the past, but I'm really impressed and I will pay attention in the future. If you're self-publishing, you should absolutely understand issues of sustainability in board game production. Watching One Pip Wonder would be a great start, and hopefully it will inspire you to explore more deeply how you can reduce the environmental impact of your games. If you're licensing your games to publishers, well then you're going to have less control, but don't underestimate the impact you can make by simply asking questions, making requests about materials, and choosing carefully who you want to work with. Rob Fisher and I designed a three-dimensional game with great table presence, constructed entirely out of cardboard. I don't currently know whether the final production will feature cardboard components or whether the publisher will opt for plastic. They've gone back and forth on that several times over the last couple of years of development of the game. But the potential for cardboard construction was a significant part of every pitch that we made. And ultimately, of course, we're leaving it in the hands of experienced professional game makers to decide what is realistic, durable, and appropriate for their market. There's a point where an inventor has to step away and accept that the game is no longer in their hands. But I'm really glad that we made them aware of the possibilities and our basic principles as designers. Think carefully about the environmental impact of your game from the early stages. Does it need all those plastic miniatures, all those dice? If you don't put them in your original prototype, the chances are that the publisher won't add them in later. I should be clear that I recognise that my own designs published to date have not always been totally environmentally friendly, but I would like to think that every component included is absolutely necessary, and that where sustainability is a concern, I've had those conversations with publishers. I'm talking to publishers right now who are specifically creating lines of games with eco-production firmly in mind. I really hope that we'll see more and more of this in the industry over coming years. Well, that was a massive set of topics to pull together into one relatively short video. I've probably overlooked all sorts of important factors, but I really couldn't conceive of a series of videos about product design where this conversation doesn't feature. So I've taken a stab at it. My main piece of advice to designers out there is to look really closely at who you're working with. Research them. What's their past history? Do they take this stuff seriously? Are you and them on the same page? New designers often get trapped into a mode of thinking that they have no power or control, that they have to accept the first offer of publication that comes along, and it just isn't true. The publishers need inventors just as much as we need them, and if your game is good enough, you can afford to turn down a dubious publisher. In fact, you probably shouldn't be showing the game to them in the first place. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe, comment, and watch some of my others, and I'll see you next time.